Nowadays, you can buy a regular t-shirt for $10 to $12. When buying such a t-shirt, we usually don't think about where this t-shirt was sewn, how difficult the production was, and how much the labor cost. After reading a lot of research, reports, and articles about how the modern textile industry works, it becomes interesting to look at the label. It turned out that my t-shirt was made in Bangladesh, a country where the textile industry plays the same role for the economy as oil does for Saudi Arabia. At the same time, the country itself will receive only a small part of the cost of the t-shirt, and the person who sewed the t-shirt will receive even less, a couple of cents. The question arises, can Bangladesh repeat the economic success of Great Britain, Korea, Taiwan, and China, using the textile industry as a basis for further development? Or will such a strategy lead to dependence on rich countries and cheap labor? Let's figure it out. Imagine that you were born in Bangladesh. It is a Muslim country, the 7th most populous country in the world, and one of the most densely populated, with a population of over 171 million people in an area of 148,460 square kilometers. Bangladesh has excellent conditions for agriculture, mild climate, rich fertile plains. Most of them are located at an altitude of less than 12 meters above sea level. This means a high risk of flooding during the monsoon season. Besides, your family is probably very poor. According to forecasts of the International Monetary Fund, in 2025, Bangladesh will take the 148th place in the world in terms of GDP per capita, only $2,700 per year, which is significantly lower than in Russia. Now, imagine that you were born in Bangladesh as a woman. You will receive at least an elementary education. And what's next? How will you earn money if your husband is suddenly unable to support your family? Your choice will be very simple: agriculture or a garment factory. And you'll be very lucky if it's a garment factory. After all, this industry feeds the whole country, which means it will feed you somehow. Until the middle of the 19th century, it was impossible to buy ready-made clothes anywhere in the world, only from a second-hand seller or something unclaimed from an atelier. The rich could make a custom-made suit, and everyone else sewed their own clothes. The advent of sewing machines has greatly simplified this process. Small workshops were the first to appear, followed by factories for the mass production of ready-to-wear. This period coincided with the beginning of women's entry into the official labour market, so that garment factories became an example of typical female employment almost all over the world. Despite rapid technological progress and the advent of sophisticated machines and synthetic materials, until the late 1960s, almost every country sewed most of its clothes independently. North America and Europe became leaders. In the first post-war decades, they accounted for about 85% of global clothing production. If someone didn't have enough clothes, people bought them in the West, but such clothes were expensive. Meanwhile, the world was changing. As the countries of Asia and Africa gained independence, more and more new and extremely poor states appeared on the map. It was important for such countries to integrate into the global market. Their main offer to the world was very cheap labour, which could be used in simple industrial production. Labour productivity in factories is usually higher than in agriculture, so there was no way out of poverty without industrialization. Bangladesh was one of the last to enter this race, only by the 1980s, and started from a very low economic base. In a short period of time, the country has managed to make an impressive leap forward, and today, as in the pre-colonial era of Bengal many centuries ago, Bangladesh is well known to the world for its export of clothing. What is needed to buy an export industry? Money, factories, experience, connections, of course. But, as the example of Bangladesh has shown, you can start with almost nothing, without large investors, without a developed industry, and without a stable state. The main thing is to give what the world wants: cheap labour and political compliance. Hundreds of years ago, long before the multi-story garment factories producing clothes for H&M, Zara and Uniqlo appeared in the Ganges and Brahmaputra Delta, Bengal was already known for its textiles. Local weavers made the finest handmade muslin, so light that, according to legend, a sari made of muslin would be stretched through a small ring. Fabrics from Bengal were bought all over the world, from Europe to Japan. For example, more than half of the textiles that Dutch merchants brought from Asia were produced in Bengal. That changed with the arrival of the British. The metropolises used colonies for two purposes: the extraction of cheap raw materials and the market for finished goods. The Industrial Revolution in England began with textiles, and England did not want to have competitors. The colonial authorities purposefully destroyed the weaving industries throughout British India, from present-day Pakistan to modern Myanmar. Duties, special tariffs, and direct prohibitions were used for this purpose. Since the end of the 18th century, many weaving centres stopped working, and Bengal turned from an exporter of fabrics to a region that bought clothes from England at inflated prices. In 1947, East Bengal became part of Pakistan under the name East Pakistan. The textile industry existed only nominally. There were several large spinning and weaving factories, and there was almost no production of ready-to-wear. Islamabad's economic policy clearly favoured Western Pakistan, and the east of the country found itself on the sidelines. In 1971, Bangladesh gained independence after a terrible war with Pakistan, where millions of people died in 9 months. GDP was one of the lowest in the world. About 80% of the population worked in agriculture, and infrastructure and industry were almost destroyed. The first post-war government sought to build socialism and nationalized everything. In 1974, there was a terrible famine that claimed the lives of hundreds of thousands. The necessary reforms that gave a real start to Bangladesh's textile growth began in the late 1970s. Bangladesh's first major success came with the introduction of an international quota system for clothing imports under the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, known as the Multi-Fiber Agreement. This system had been in place since 1974 and limited the supply of clothing to rich Western countries from those developing countries that had already established strong market positions, such as South Korea, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. Asian contractors and customers from the United States and Europe began to look for new countries that still had free quotas and turned their attention to Bangladesh. In 1978, the South Korean Daewoo Corporation proposed to the government of Bangladesh to establish a joint venture. This is how Desh Garments was founded, the country's first truly export-oriented factory for the production of ready-to-wear. Under the terms of the contract, Daewoo has trained 130 Desh employees in South Korea for free. After the internship, these people returned to Bangladesh with practical skills and knowledge, understanding how export-oriented production should work. Soon, Desh received the first orders for clothes from Europe and the USA. This was a turning point. Women from Bangladesh, who had previously worked in homes or fields, began working in factories, sewing trousers and t-shirts for Walmart, JCPenney, Sears, and other major American retailers. Trained workers left Desh Garments and started their own businesses, because now there were enough customers and orders for everyone. Production volumes grew, even though Bangladesh did not have its own cotton and large textile industries. The fabric was imported from abroad. In the beginning, there were almost no mid-level specialists with good qualifications in Bangladesh. The state supported the growing export industry. The country began to create free economic zones with tax benefits for residents, introduced duty-free import of raw materials and equipment for the garment industry, organised special customs warehouses, a logistics and energy supply system. But the main competitive advantage remained cheap labour. In 1985, the average monthly salary of a Bengali seamstress was about $10. The seamstress worked 6 to 7 days a week for 10 to 12 hours a day. Protests or strong trade unions were rare. In most cases, workers maintained discipline because they needed money and were afraid of losing their jobs. Therefore, the industry was actively growing. By the 1990s, Bangladesh was already producing more clothes than Pakistan or Sri Lanka, and that was just the beginning. At the turn of the century, the concept of fast fashion burst into mass fashion, ultra-fast updating of collections, when new models arrive in stores every 2 or 3 weeks rather than several times a year. Major Western brands that worked on this concept, H&M, Zara, Gap, Uniqlo, and many others, needed suppliers who sew quickly, in large volumes, and for very low fees. By this point, Bangladesh already had dozens of large factories, hundreds of thousands of workers, and the conditions that global capital was looking for: poverty, dependence on foreign orders, and, as a result, a willingness to obey the authorities. Thus, the interests of both sides coincided. In the early 1990s, Bangladesh's total exports were less than $2 billion per year. By 2000, this figure had tripled. By the end of the 2000s, annual export revenues reached approximately $23 billion. 10 years later, before the COVID-19 pandemic, exports crossed the $40 billion mark, and 2 years later, about $10 billion was added to this amount. Since the beginning of the 21st century, almost all of the growth has been due to the sale of ready-to-wear. In 1999, ready-to-wear accounted for 3/4 of all export earnings. The level of 80% was reached in 2013 and has never been lower. This is comparable to the share of oil revenues from Saudi Arabia's total exports. Since 2015, Bangladesh has become the second country in the world in terms of export revenues from ready-to-wear. Only China earns more. In terms of size and level of industrialization, China will remain a leader for a long time. For comparison, according to the WTO, the total exports of clothing from the EU countries last year only slightly exceeded China's figures. In 2024, Bangladesh exported approximately $38.5 billion worth of clothing. Almost 80% of this amount came from buyers from Europe and the USA. Is it a lot or a little? This is a great result for Bangladesh, but comparisons are important. For example, in 2024, the revenue from the sale of clothing by the Spanish Inditex Group, owner of Zara, Bershka, Massimo Dutti, Pull & Bear, Oysho, Stradivarius, was more than the total revenue of 5,000 garment factories in Bangladesh. At the same time, these factories sew not only for Inditex, but also for many other global retailers. In addition, Western countries produce a lot of clothes for their own markets by themselves. Comparing this data shows how big the difference is between the incomes of clothing manufacturers and the incomes of retailers who sell clothes to end customers. In the world, ready-to-wear is now more affordable than ever before. In some countries, prices may behave differently due to inflation and devaluation. But in countries with stable consumer price indices and exchange rates, clothing has become much more affordable. According to official data, clothing prices in the United States stopped rising about 35 years ago. The situation is similar in Europe, and this affects the purchase prices of manufacturers in countries such as Bangladesh. According to McKinsey estimates, in 2011 to 2020, the average cost of importing one t-shirt from Bangladesh to the EU did not change and amounted to about 1.5 euros per piece. At the same time, Bangladesh's share in the European t-shirt market has grown from 44% to 59% over the past 10 years. The reason for the export growth is obvious: cheap labor. According to research, the retail price of clothing is usually 7 to 8 times higher than the cost of production. An example of a calculation from the blog of the French brand Bonegel: if a designer t-shirt is sold for 50 euros, its production is less than 7 euros. About half of this amount is spent on fabric and transportation. The remaining 3.5 euros covers cutting, sewing, dyeing, finishing, and packaging. These 3.5 euros include not only seamstresses' salaries, but also other production costs, such as energy payments. Data from the human rights organization Clean Clothes Campaign shows a different pricing model. With the retail price of a t-shirt in a European store at 29 euros, more than 60% of this amount remains with the retailer to cover the store's profit, staff salaries, rent, and sales taxes. The brand's profit is about 12%, and transportation costs are about 8%. Less than 20% of the retail price remains for production in Bangladesh, and a significant part of this goes to the import of fabrics and equipment. The Clean Clothes Campaign infographic indicates that the seamstress receives about 18 euro cents for such a t-shirt, but this estimate, according to many experts, is overestimated. Since 1994, the minimum wage in Bangladesh has been revised 6 times, and increases have occurred most often under pressure from mass protests. During these protests, workers were harassed, fired, and even arrested. Starting in November 2023, the minimum monthly salary for sewing machine operators, approximately 4 million people, more than 60% of whom are women, has been raised to 12,500 taka. At the current exchange rate, it's just over $100 per month. According to the local Labour Research Institute, the real cost of living in the country is about $300 per month. To earn more, workers take extra hours. According to the US International Trade Commission, in 2023, the average nominal salary of a seamstress in Bangladesh was $140. In Pakistan, the rate was lower. After taking into account the difference in the cost of living, salaries in Bangladesh are among the lowest among major clothing-producing countries. According to various estimates, the average monthly production of one seamstress in Bangladesh is about 2,000 pieces. This means that for each hand-sewn item, an employee earns less than 10 cents. The events of April 24, 2013 showed the whole world what it's like to provide for a family by earning money at a garment factory in Bangladesh. The 8-story Rana Plaza building collapsed in a suburb of Dhaka. There were 5 garment factories, a bank, and several shops inside. According to official data, 1,134 people died under the rubble, and more than 2,500 were injured. This was the largest industrial disaster of the 21st century in peacetime. It wasn't an earthquake. The building originally had 4 floors, but the owners added 4 more floors and placed heavy industrial equipment there, without permission. The day before the collapse, cracks appeared in the walls, and the tenants withdrew their employees. The owners of the garment factories refused to close the workshops and demanded that people return to work in the morning. A few hours later, the building collapsed. Among the brands that were sewn at Rana Plaza were Benetton, Mango, Zara, C&A, Walmart, and others. Mass protests began in Bangladesh. Foreign customers stated that they were unaware of such conditions from their contractors. Dozens of people who were responsible for managing the building were convicted. Foreign brands began to carry out regular inspections at factories. But more than a decade has passed, and seamstresses in Bangladesh still often work for low pay in multi-story workshops without fire exits. The only change is the additional concrete columns. Some factory managers explain why they did not close production. They are under pressure from large foreign customers. If the brand demands to reduce the price to €5 per t-shirt, the contractor can either agree or lose the order. If the contractor misses the deadline, the order will go to another one. There are many such factories in Asia and Africa. This reduces costs, including security costs. The imbalance between customers and contractors causes the use of child labour. According to UNICEF and the ILO, about 1.7 million miners in Bangladesh were employed in 2022. More than half worked in dangerous conditions, including in the textile industry. The law formally prohibits the admission of children under the age of 14 to registered production facilities. But children continue to be employed in artisanal factories and subcontracts, more often in evening and night shifts. Child labour includes ironing, folding, packing, carrying cloth, hemming, and trimming threads. They usually receive several tens of dollars for their work. The international community tried to solve this problem. In 1993, the Bangladeshi government forced the dismissal of approximately 50,000 children from factories by threatening to ban exports to the United States. In practice, many of these children did not return to school and moved on to even more difficult and opaque jobs: brick factories, dry cleaners, shoe repair shops. If the family depends on the child's income, external agreements often do not solve the problem. The numbers often don't look as dramatic as the story. Since independence in 1971, Bangladesh's GDP has grown from $9 billion to $450 billion. This is an increase of more than 50 times. Bangladesh's economy has only grown since 1976. Over the past 20 years, the growth rate has been mostly above 5% per year, with a break in the COVID-19 pandemic and the political crisis with the change of government last year. GDP per capita has also increased. Bangladesh has caught up with Pakistan, and in 2019 overtook India in this indicator. Statistics also show a rapid increase in household incomes. In 2000, almost half of the population lived below the poverty line, and 30% lived on just over $2 a day. By 2022, these figures have dropped to about 19% and 10% respectively. Research confirms this data. Hundreds of thousands of poor families have indeed improved their standard of living, largely due to their work in the garment industry. This work has become especially important for women, who, despite the difficult working conditions, have received almost the only available opportunity to earn and pay for education for their children. International organizations note that the involvement of the poor in paid work has reduced the country's dependence on international aid, with which Bangladesh has gone through part of the path of classical industrial development. At the same time, such growth may be unstable. The global ready-to-wear market will continue to grow and may exceed $2 trillion in the next couple of years. It is dangerous when a country's entire economy depends on only one industry, especially one as populous as Bangladesh. The price of maintaining leadership is low salaries. If wages start to rise strongly, orders will go to manufacturers with cheaper labor. Automating mass production of clothing is still expensive and unprofitable, and robots will not replace seamstresses for a long time. This is good news for poor countries. Another risk is a chronic trade deficit. Last year, it exceeded $20 billion. Now the situation is being saved by the money sent home by millions of workers from abroad. These transfers help to keep prices and the national currency stable. But this situation cannot continue in the long term. The second growth support is the official status of a country with a low level of development in the UN classification. This makes it easier to access preferential terms of trade. For example, goods from Bangladesh are almost duty-free when shipped to the EU. However, as Bangladesh's economy grows, it is moving closer to leaving this category, and trade preferences may be lost. However, this may happen earlier. For example, in April of this year, the US president announced an increase in tariffs for Bangladesh to 35% from the previous 15%. Later, the rate was lowered to 20%, and Bangladesh took this as a significant concession. Many countries that started with textiles have moved to the next level by manufacturing and exporting more complex products. Steel, machinery, chemicals, transportation equipment, and consumer electronics. Examples of success include Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and China. None of them became rich by producing only t-shirts. The production and export of pharmaceutical products and plastics is growing in Bangladesh, but none of these industries has become a full-fledged supporter for national exports. Bangladesh will have to do something. Otherwise, the country will depend solely on textiles, like Saudi Arabia, whose exports are based on oil.